Hello, dear friends. My name is Claire Thompson, and at 62 years old, I've learned a thing or two about trusting my instincts, sometimes the hard way. If you're watching this, I hope you'll settle in with a warm cup of tea or coffee, because I'm about to share a story that still sends a shiver down my spine when I think about it. I'd love for you to hit that like button if you've ever had a moment where your gut whispered something wasn't right, and subscribe if you want to hear how I learned to listen to mine. This is a story I've held close for a long time, one I wasn't sure I'd ever share. But here I am, ready to let you in on a moment that changed how I see trust friendship and the quiet evenings that can turn your world upside down. It was a rainy Tuesday evening, the kind where the world feels hushed and heavy with clouds so thick you can't tell if it's 6 o'clock or midnight. I was home alone, stirring a pot of chicken noodle soup in our cozy kitchen, the one my husband Tom and I had spent years making our own. Tom was away on a business trip, something about a conference in Chicago, and the house felt a little too big without him. The radio played soft jazz, and I was humming along trying to fill the silence. I'd just gotten home from my part-time job at the library, my hair still damp from the downpour outside, and all I wanted was a quiet night with my soup and a good book. Tom and I have been married for 32 years, and let me tell you, we've built a life I'm proud of. It's not perfect, whose is his, but it's ours. We've got 2 grown kids, a garden we argue over, and a circle of friends who've been with us through thick and thin. One of those friends is Daniel, Tom's best friend since their college days. Daniel's the kind of man who lights up a room without trying, charming, quick with a joke, always ready to lend a hand. He's been over for dinner more times than I can count usually, with his wife Ellen, though she travels a lot for work. Daniel's the one who helped us move into this house, who stood up at our wedding, who always brings a bottle of red wine and a story to share. He's family, or as close as you can get without blood. That night, as the rain tapped against the windows, I wasn't expecting company. I was in my slippers, my favorite sweater loose around my shoulders, when the doorbell rang. It startled me, the sound sharp against the soft hum of the radio. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and padded to the door, peering through the peephole. There was Daniel, his coat slick with rain, holding a manila envelope. My first thought was that something was wrong. Why else would he show up unannounced? I opened the door, and the cool, wet air rushed in. Daniel. "Goodness, you're soaked," I said, stepping aside. Come in, come in." He smiled that easy, familiar smile of his and shook the rain from his hair. "Sorry to barge in, Claire," he said, his voice warm as always. "Tom asked me to drop off some documents he forgot for the trip. Didn't want to leave them at the office." I nodded, though a tiny part of me wondered why Tom hadn't mentioned it. Still, it wasn't unusual. Daniel often ran errands for Tom, especially when work got hectic. "You didn't have to come out in this mess," I said, taking the envelope from him. "But since you're here, let me make you some tea. Warm you up before you head back out." He hesitated, just for a moment, and I caught a flicker of something in his eyes, nothing I could name, just different. But then he nodded, slipping off his coat. "That'd be nice, Claire. Thanks." I led him to the kitchen, the envelope tucked under my arm, and set the kettle on. The soup was simmering, filling the air with a comforting savory smell, and I motioned for Daniel to sit at the island. He did, leaning back in the stool, his eyes wandering around the room. I thought he was just taking in the familiar space, our mismatched mugs on the shelf, the photos of our kids on the fridge, but his gaze lingered a little too long, like he was seeing it all for the first time. Or maybe not the room, but me. I shook off the thought. I was being silly. This was Tom's Daniel, the man who danced with me at our anniversary party last year, who teased me about my terrible poker face during our game nights. I poured the tea, sliding a mug across the counter, and we chatted about nothing important. Work, the weather, how Tom was probably charming everyone at his conference. But as we talked, I noticed something. Daniel's eyes kept finding mine, holding just a second longer than they should. When I turned to stir the soup, I felt his gaze on my back steady and warm like a spotlight I hadn't asked for. I told myself it was nothing. The house was quiet. The rain was loud, and I was probably just tired. But my hands moved a little faster, my voice a little brighter, as if I could outrun the unease curling in my chest. I offered him some soup, half hoping he'd say no and head home, but he accepted settling in like he had nowhere else to be. And as we sat there, the steam rising from our bowls, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, like a door I hadn't noticed had been left ajar. I had no idea that night would change everything. No idea that the man I'd known for decades, the one I'd laughed with and trusted, was watching me in a way that wasn't friendly at all. And no idea that I'd soon find myself standing at a crossroads, wondering how to protect my peace without shattering the life we'd built. As I sipped my tea, the rain drumming on the roof, I felt it, a prickle of awareness, like the air itself was holding its breath. Daniel smiled across the table, and I smiled back, but my heart was beating just a little too fast. I didn't know it then, but that was the moment the story began, the moment I started to see him for who he really was. That rainy night in my kitchen with Daniel sitting across from me, the air felt heavier than it should have. The soup was warm, the tea was steaming, but there was this undercurrent, this quiet hum of something I couldn't quite name. I kept telling myself I was imagining things. Daniel was Tom's best friend, for heaven's sake. He'd been in our home 100 times, shared our table, our laughter. But as we talked, his eyes kept finding mine, lingering in a way that made my skin prickle. Not friendly, not casual, but searching. I pushed the thought away, focusing on the clink of my spoon against the bowl, the soft jazz still playing on the radio. But it was there, that feeling like a shadow moving just out of sight. Daniel leaned back in his stool, his hands wrapped around the mug of tea, and started telling me about his day. Something about a project at work, a deadline he'd barely met. His voice was smooth, familiar, but there was a cadence to it, a warmth that felt too deliberate. I nodded, smiled, asked questions, but my mind was racing. Why was he still here? The documents were delivered. The rain wasn't that bad. Ellen, his wife, was out of town, I remembered him saying. But surely he had somewhere to be. I glanced at the clock, 7:45 p.m., and wondered how to politely nudge him toward the door. "You're a good listener, Claire," he said suddenly, his voice softer, pulling me out of my thoughts. I looked up, and there it was again, that gaze steady and unblinking, like he was seeing something in me I hadn't offered. My cheeks warmed, and I laughed a little too loudly to cover the flutter in my chest. "Oh, I don't know about that," I said, standing to clear the dishes. "I just try to keep up." I turned toward the sink, grateful for the excuse to break eye contact, but I could still feel him watching me. The kitchen felt smaller, the walls closer, and I fumbled with the bowls, the clatter louder than it needed to be. He didn't move to help, which was unusual. Daniel was always the first to jump in clearing plates or pouring wine. Instead, he stayed seated, his fingers tapping lightly against the mug. "You shouldn't be alone like this," he said, his tone so quiet I almost missed it. I froze the dishwater warm against my hands and turned slowly to face him. "What do you mean?" I asked, keeping my voice light, though my heart was thudding. I told myself, He was just being kind, concerned like any friend would be. Tom was away after all, and Daniel knew how quiet the house could get. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Just a woman like you, in this big house, all by yourself. It's not right. His words hung in the air, soft but heavy like a stone dropped into still water. A woman like you. What did that even mean? I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out. My mind was scrambling, trying to make sense of the shift, the way his voice seemed to curl around the edges of something unspoken. I forced a laugh, wiping my hands on a towel. I've been managing just fine for years, Daniel. You know me. I moved back to the island, keeping it between us, and reached for my tea, though it had gone cold. He watched every move, his eyes tracking my hands, my face, and I felt exposed like I was standing under a spotlight I hadn't signed up for. I do know you, he said, leaning forward slightly, his voice dropping lower. Better than you think. My breath caught, and for a moment, the room was too quiet, the rain outside the only sound. I wanted to ask what he meant, but my throat felt tight, my instincts screaming at me to steer the conversation somewhere safe. I didn't know how to respond, didn't want to know what might come next. Instead, I glanced at the envelope he'd brought, still sitting on the counter. Oh, I should put these away for Tom, I said, my voice too bright, too quick. I picked it up, hoping the movement would break whatever spell was settling over the room. But as I did, his hand brushed against mine just for a second as he reached for his mug. It was fleeting, barely a touch, but it sent a jolt through me, sharp and unwelcome. I pulled back, clutching the envelope like a shield, and his eyes flickered with something amusement. Regret I couldn't tell. Sorry, he said. But he didn't sound sorry. He sounded pleased, like he'd gotten the reaction he wanted. My heart was beating faster now. My thoughts a jumble of confusion and denial. This was Daniel. Daniel who'd helped me plant roses in the backyard, who'd toasted our 30th anniversary with a speech that made me cry. But this wasn't that Daniel. This was someone else. Someone whose gaze felt like it was peeling back layers I hadn't meant to show. I mumbled something about needing to check the stove and turned away, my hands trembling as I adjusted a knob that didn't need adjusting. The jazz on the radio felt too loud now, too intimate, and I wanted to shut it off to fill the silence with something else. But I didn't. I stood there, pretending to fuss with the burners while my mind raced. Was I overreacting? Was I reading too much into a look? A touch? A few strange words? Or was something happening here, something I didn't want to name? When I turned back, he was standing, his coat in his hands, and relief washed over me. I should get going, he said, his smile back to normal, the one I knew from game nights and barbecues. Thanks for the tea, Claire, and the soup. You're too good to me, I nodded, forcing a smile. Any time, Daniel. Drive safe out there. My voice sounded steady, but inside I was a mess. I walked him to the door, keeping my distance, and as he stepped out into the rain, he turned back, his eyes locking onto mine one last time. See you soon, he said. And there was something in his voice, a promise I didn't want to hear. I closed the door quickly, locking it, and leaned against it, my breath shaky. The house was quiet again, but it didn't feel safe anymore. I stood there for a long time, the envelope still in my hands, wondering what had just happened and why I felt like I'd narrowly escaped something I didn't fully understand. I stood there, my back against the locked door, my breath still unsteady. The house was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet now. One that didn't feel safe, didn't feel like mine anymore. I clutched the envelope Daniel had brought as if it could anchor me to reality, but my mind was a tangle of questions. What had I seen in his eyes? What had I heard in his voice? And why? No matter how hard I tried, could I not shake the feeling that something was about to unravel? That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment, every word, every look, every fleeting touch. Was I blowing it out of proportion? Misreading a moment that meant nothing? Or was something happening? Something I wasn't ready to face. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, I'd made up my mind. At our next weekly dinner, just a few days away on Friday, I'd watch him closely. I needed to know if this feeling was real, or if it was just a shadow I'd conjured in my own mind. But as I pulled the covers up, I couldn't shake the sense that I was stepping towards something I might not be prepared for. Friday came faster than I wanted, and I found myself in the kitchen preparing for the weekly dinner I used to love. That rainy night just a few days ago still lingered in my mind, like a song stuck on repeat. I'd tried to act normal, to smile when Tom came home from his trip, to pretend nothing had changed. But everything had. I was counting down to this dinner, not with the usual excitement, but with a gnawing unease. Daniel would be there as always, and I knew I had to face him, if only to prove I'd been wrong, or worse, that I'd been right. Tom noticed I was quieter than usual. "You okay, Claire?" he asked that morning as I chopped vegetables for the roast chicken. I nodded, blamed it on work fatigue, but inside I was wrestling. How could I tell him that his best friend, the man he trusted like family, was making me feel like I was caught in a web of his gazes? How could I explain this feeling like Daniel was seeing me not as a friend, but as something else I had no proof? Just a gut instinct, and I was terrified that speaking up would break something we couldn't fix. Daniel arrived alone, a bottle of Merlot in hand, his smile as easy as ever. Ellen was in Seattle. He said some big work conference. Tom clapped him on the back, poured the wine, and the three of us sat around the dining table, the candles flickering, the smell of roasted chicken filling the air. To anyone else, it would have looked like any other night, warm, comfortable, familiar. But I was on edge, my hands restless in my lap, my eyes avoiding Daniel's. And yet I felt him watching me. Not all the time, not overtly, but in moments when I passed him the bread, when I laughed at one of Tom's jokes, when I got up to clear the plates. His gaze was like a weight, heavy and deliberate, and it made my skin crawl. I tried to focus on Tom, on the stories he was telling about his conference, but my mind kept drifting to that night in the kitchen, to the way Daniel had said, "I know you better than you think." What did he mean? Was it just a throwaway line? Or was there something more? I hated how it consumed me, how I was questioning everything, every smile, every gesture, every time he'd been in our home. Had he always looked at me this way, and I just never noticed? Or was this new, some line he'd decided to cross? After dinner, Tom suggested a card game, but I couldn't bear the thought of sitting across from Daniel any longer. I excused myself, saying I needed to tidy the kitchen, and Tom, bless him, didn't push. Daniel offered to help, but I waved him off, my voice sharper than I meant it to be. "I've got it," I said, and he raised an eyebrow just slightly before settling back into his chair. I fled to the kitchen, grateful for the distance, and started washing dishes, the hot water grounding me, giving me something to focus on. But the unease didn't fade. It grew, twisting into something sharper, something that felt like fear. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe it was the wine. Maybe it was the way my nerves were frayed to breaking, but I decided I couldn't keep pretending. I needed to know, needed to stop this before it went any further. I dried my hands, took a deep breath, and waited until Tom stepped outside to take a call, leaving Daniel alone in the living room. My heart was pounding, but I walked in, my voice steady despite the tremor in my chest. "Daniel," I said, standing in the doorway, "can we talk for a minute?" He looked up from his wine glass, his expression unreadable, and nodded. I led him to the study, away from the open windows, away from Tom's voice drifting in from the porch. The room was dim, lit only by a small lamp, and I closed the door behind us, my hands shaking. "What's going on, Claire?" he asked, his tone light, but there was an edge to it, like he knew this wasn't a casual chat. I crossed my arms, trying to hold myself together, and looked him in the eye. "I need you to stop." I said, the words coming out firmer than I expected. "The way you've been looking at me, the things you've said, it's not okay. It's making me uncomfortable, and it needs to stop." My voice wavered at the end, but I held his gaze, waiting. For a moment, he didn't say anything, just studied me, his eyes narrowing slightly. Then he stepped closer, and my breath caught. "Claire," he said, his voice low, "I don't know what you think you've seen, but you're not wrong." My stomach dropped, and I took a step back, my back brushing against the bookshelf. "I've been watching you," he went on, his words slow, deliberate. "I can't help it. You're not like anyone else, and I know you've felt it too." I shook my head, my throat tight. "No, Daniel, I haven't. You're Tom's friend and I'm married. Whatever you think this is, it's not real." But he didn't stop. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope worn at the edges and held it out to me. My hands stayed at my sides, but he pressed it into my palm, his fingers lingering too long. "Read them," he said. "They're for you. They've always been for you." I stared at the envelope, my mind racing, and when I looked up, he was closer, his eyes searching mine. "I've been writing to you for months," he whispered. "Anonymous, because I didn't know how to say it, but I can't keep pretending." I felt like the room was spinning. Anonymous letters I'd received a few over the past year, handwritten notes left in our mailbox, full of compliments, poetry, things I'd assumed were from Tom, or a mistake. I'd kept them tucked away in a drawer, thinking they were sweet, harmless. But Daniel, my husband's best friend, I wanted to scream, to throw the envelope back at him, but I was frozen. My heart pounding so loud I could barely think. Before I could respond, the door swung open, and Tom stood there, his phone still in his hand, his face a mix of confusion and concern. "Claire, Daniel, what's going on?" His voice was steady, but his eyes darted between us, sensing the tension. Daniel stepped back, his expression shifting to something neutral. But I was shaking, the envelope burning in my hand. I looked at Tom, then at Daniel, and made a choice. "Tom," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "we need to talk. Alone." I turned to Daniel, my eyes hard. "You should go." He hesitated, then nodded, brushing past Tom without a word. The front door clicked shut behind him, and I stood there, the envelope still in my hand, my world tilting. That night, I told Tom everything. The looks, the words, the letters. He listened, his face growing darker, and when I showed him the envelope, he opened it, reading the words Daniel had written, words that should never have been mine. We sat in silence for a long time, the weight of it all settling over us. I felt relief, but also sorrow for the friendship we'd lost, for the trust that had been broken. Looking back, I realized I'd saved myself by speaking up, by trusting my instincts. But the cost was heavy, a fracture in our world that would take time to heal. I learned to set boundaries, to protect my peace, even when it hurt, and I'll never forget the lesson one moment of silence can cost you everything. So, dear friends, if this story touched you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Comment below with your own moments of trusting your gut. I'd love to know I'm not alone. And subscribe for more stories that remind us to listen to that quiet voice inside.